Adam Soos here for Rebel News. Very happy now to be joined by Rebecca Schulz, the Minister of Environment and Protected Areas here in Alberta. Thanks for taking this time to speak with us. I suppose the first thing I wanted to talk to you about is that the federal court ruled effectively that the ban on or the deeming of plastics as being toxic substances was unconstitutional, unreasonable, among other things. Has the federal government sort of backtracked from that at all, or are they still planning to proceed with a challenge and appeal?
You know, it is so wild because we're seeing exactly what we saw when we saw the court decision on Bill C-69, that the federal government is acting in a way that is wildly unconstitutional, disregarding provincial jurisdiction. And on the plastics front, it is unreasonable and unconstitutional. And, you know, the interesting thing is, you know, we hear the federal government say, we'll just make a couple tweaks. You can't actually just tweak legislation that at its very core is unconstitutional and expect to get a different response. And so we see this federal government that just seems to completely be disregarding the decisions that are coming from the highest courts in our country. And so I would say no. I mean, we haven't seen reasonability on this. We've really tried to say, you know, especially to Minister Guilbeault, my counterpart, let's look at these court decisions and recognize the work that provinces are doing. You know, when it comes to recycling and plastics, extended producer responsibility being rolled out in provinces across the country, we know how to do this work. We're doing it better. And what the federal government is doing is getting in the way of what we're actually trying to do good things on the ground. And so, you know, I would love to see a change of course from the federal government, but as of yet, we haven't seen that. We see them doubling down on these policies, again, despite the fact that they have been told that they are unconstitutional.
Now, while not that long after that ruling came out, we saw a number of municipalities, Calgary and Edmonton, nominally adopting these single-use bylaws. They are so wildly unpopular across the board that by the time people are watching this interview, they may not be in effect anymore. I know that city councillors in Calgary are already putting forward a motion for that to be repealed. But does this government feel that at times, whether it be Mayor G.O.T. Gondek or Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, they're advancing sort of ideological agendas that the majority of Albertans don't agree with? The polls make that clear. Do you feel like you're fighting battles on two fronts?
You know, I think sometimes yes, and it'll be interesting to see what's coming out of the discussion at council today. I think that's happening literally as we are speaking right now. I know that city councillors were bringing that motion forward, and I think ultimately it's ineffective. I mean, just a couple of months ago, we were seemingly aligned with the city of Calgary on essentially asking the federal government to relax their plastics ban. And the example was that of the co-op compostable bags. And so even the mayor of Calgary had reached out to the federal government to say, look, like here we have this Calgary innovator, Leaf Environmental Products, come up with a bag that is not plastic. It is 100% not plastic. It is fully compostable. It also solves an issue of compostability and encourages people, Calgarians, to compost. And the city and the mayor had reached out to the federal government saying, this doesn't make sense. It's getting in the way of Calgarians doing great things. I reiterated that, saying, again, this is why the federal government should stay in its own lane. They should allow provinces to make these decisions, to allow for flexibility, because there are differences between municipalities, and allow us to have this jurisdictional space, which constitutionally is ours. And so ultimately, it's just ineffective. It creates uncertainty. It adds costs on everyday people who are already struggling with affordability right now. And so it just seems like there's this ideology driving the narrative and not common sense, or not driving the narrative, I would say driving the decisions.
Now, ultimately, there's a lot of talk of sort of subsidiarity, the federal government leaving the provincial government to do its own thing. But given how wildly unpopular this is there a possibility if councils are unable to retract this, that the province would step in?
I mean, it's a little bit too early for me to say that. You know, what I would say is that we consulted on our extended producer responsibility program. We are working with municipalities on rolling that out. I'm pretty confident in where that's headed. And so, you know, I do think that there is a very big risk in terms of municipalities all doing additional and yet different things in different areas across the province. I think one of the reasons why extended producer responsibility, our program, is a positive it allows some uniformity. It allows us to add some economies of scale, to manage some of the costs, to put the costs back on the producers versus the consumers, and essentially keep more of the plastics in that circular economy and out of landfills and rivers and lakes and all those types of things. So, I think it's just you're hearing right now Albertans frustrated at what's happening in certain municipalities. You definitely hear Canadians and provinces articulating their frustration with the federal government's policies. And then you see the courts saying, this is unreasonable and unconstitutional, but we haven't seen a change in their approach just yet.
No, it's interesting there because the sort of sentiment of sort of staying in your lane, we have seen municipal politics sort of expand and impose what I'd argue are some ideological bylaws and policies. Then we see the federal government sort of overreaching and pushing maybe into the provincial jurisdiction. How much do you think that sort of activist mentality factors into breaking down? We used to think of cities as like basic bylaws, maintaining roads, maybe things like that. But that seems to have expanded in the last few years, particularly under this mayor.
I would just say maybe it's hard for me to exactly answer that question. But I do think, look, when it comes to our recycling programs and extended producer responsibility and the work that's happening here in Alberta, it's similar to what's been happening in other provinces. But we couldn't do it without partnering, having positive conversations with municipalities about, what feasibly can be done, what makes sense from a cost perspective, what has the biggest impact when it comes to recycling, helping make sure that recycling is in fact encouraged and happening, and we're seeing those numbers go up, that we're bringing more of those plastics, like I said, into our circular economy. We couldn't have done this without municipalities. So I do want to say I value those partnerships, and that's why I think sometimes then it gets confusing, and certainly that's what I've been hearing. The feedback I've been hearing is, why do we allow this to happen? But I also respect that municipalities have the ability to make decisions for their own communities. The Municipal Government Act allows them to do that. And so I think that's maybe what you're seeing is in terms of the councillors today saying, look, our constituents, they have concerns. This is why we're bringing forward these amendments. And we'll see where that discussion goes. But I do respect, that municipal elected group of councillors and mayor to make some of those decisions. But again, I just think we get to far better solutions if we're working together using common sense and we've got some alignment across the province.
Both yourself and Premier Danielle Smith have said that the emissions cap effectively on our energy sectors would not be implemented here. Has been like any sort of ground made whatsoever with the federal government, or is it turning into ultimately a legal battle?
As I shared when we were in Dubai, we had a news conference with the Premier, and that was a very, very challenging week, I would say, in terms of our relationship with Ottawa, just given the fact that, meeting with the minister, they were not willing to provide us information on what this oil and gas cap was ultimately going to look like. And I think if we want to see a constructive federalism, if we had that at this current time, we would have had the ability to discuss those policies that, of course, are impacting provincial jurisdiction. We do still have our bilateral tables. Premier Danielle Smith, after the election said, look, we are going to try to put political differences aside, get to the table, have common sense discussions about policies that impact our jurisdiction. Unfortunately, on things like clean electricity and an oil and gas cap, we've seen the opposite. This cap fundamentally is about capping productions. What the federal government put out will absolutely have an impact on hundreds of thousands of jobs, the GDP and the economies of both Alberta and Canada. Like, this would absolutely impact the ability that we have to fund basic programs, healthcare, education, you name it. It would have a huge impact on municipalities, on First Nations communities and their employment opportunities and the like as well. We are working, of course, at the department level to provide that feedback. Some of it is the federal government just chose to use modeling. That is unreasonable and unrealistic. And so, we've been taking the time to really stick to the facts and say, look, this doesn't work for us. This is why we're not going to implement that here. And I think fundamentally, and Premier Smith has said this as well, we are working to reduce emissions, but we are not going to reduce our energy production at a time when the world needs affordable, reliable, safe, ethically produced energy, which we can produce here in Alberta and quite frankly across Canada.
And frankly, putting those things out reduces global emissions, but that's an aside altogether. And something else that has come along is this new and rather absurd sentiment of no gas-powered vehicles, new gas-powered vehicles being sold after 2035. With recent power shortages here in Alberta alone, we know that simply is not feasible. Will that happen in Alberta ever?
And Premier has also been very clear on that. Like, I think she was quoted as saying, this might just be the most ridiculous policy that we've seen yet. We cannot tell Canadians what kind of car they're going to drive. I think we've seen rental companies across North America say that they're moving away from their EV fleets for a variety of reasons. I think that what we saw in terms of that cold snap here in January, I just happened to be touring natural gas facilities I think it was minus 50 with the wind chill, very grateful for our energy industry and our climate, but also then we saw those issues with some of the grid stability as well. Those are issues we need to address. But again, common sense. We have to look at the numbers. We have to look at the data. We have to use common sense. And absolutely, we are not going to be telling we should not be telling Albertans or Canadians what kind of car they're going to drive.
Can the province, obviously this is early days, but is there a potential for Alberta to just import vehicles directly if the rest of the country goes along with this?
I think more work has to be done just in terms of analyzing what we can do at the provincial level and what is a federal responsibility. But we are working alongside my colleagues in justice, in energy, of course, along with Premier Smith, to determine how we can make sure that, we remain a common sense government focused on doing the right thing, reducing emissions, and keeping all of our major industries thriving.
Now, just two more questions for you. I know we're wrapping up with our time, but whether it be the impact assessment ruling, the plastics ruling, inevitably what's likely to be a similar ruling on vehicles when they try to ban that, how concerned should Canadians be that despite the fact the highest court in the land is telling the Liberal government that over and over and over, this is unreasonable, this is unconstitutional, they just keep pushing forward? Is that a serious concern?
I, as a Canadian, have very serious concerns. I can speak for myself, but we as a government have also articulated the concerns with that, we now are in a place with Bill C-69, the No More Pipelines ban, right? Unconstitutional. Now we see it with plastics, unreasonable, unconstitutional. And we just continue to see this federal government say, okay, well, that's your opinion. We believe in the rule of law. We want to uphold, these decisions that are coming out of our justice system. I quite frankly am concerned with that. And I think a lot of Canadians are, and we're hearing that, right? And quite frankly, I think we're seeing it in the polls. Then we see, for example, the Liberal government is looking at maybe renaming or rebranding their carbon tax because it's wildly unpopular, especially again at a time when Canadians, Albertans are struggling with affordability. And obviously this carbon tax is driving up the cost of everything from fuel to groceries, you name it. I think this shows an out-of-touch government to say, you know what, we know you don't like the policy, we know Canadians don't like the carbon tax, but we'll give it a different name and we'll rebrand it and we'll go from there. I just think that's so disrespectful of the views that Canadians have. I think we saw that carve out, for example, for Atlantic provinces on the carbon tax for home heating. I think that was recognition from the federal government that this is absolutely adding to the cost of the basic utilities that Canadians cannot stay warm without. They cannot live without. Yet here in Alberta, Saskatchewan, other provinces, we use natural gas. It's a more efficient, environmentally friendly form of energy. And yet that same carve out was not applied here. I think it's just a general unfairness. And I do think the pattern that we're seeing here is ideology driving decisions that absolutely just aren't making sense for Canadians.
Well, I want to thank you so much for your time. That was Rebecca Schulz, Minister of Environment of Alberta. And as always, I want to thank everyone at home for tuning in. For Rebel News, I'm Adam Soos. Well, despite this Alberta government's assertions that they will be pushing back against some of these radical environmental agendas, the fact is they keep coming. They're being pushed municipally, they're being pushed federally, and they're being pushed by international bodies. If you want to resist this environmental revolution, sign our petition at nogreenreset.ca. municipal.com.